He was just a tired mechanic getting coffee after a 12-hour shift. They were four drunk men who thought a woman sitting alone at 11:30 at night was an easy target. What none of them knew, not the woman, not the men, not the handful of witnesses too frightened to move, was that the quiet guy in the corner booth had once led Navy SEAL teams into situations that made this greasy diner look like a church picnic. And he had already noticed something that everyone else missed. Those men didn't walk in randomly. They walked in looking for her. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you this one will keep you up past your bedtime. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to West Haven. The Harbor Moon Diner had been sitting on the edge of West Haven's working waterfront since 1987, and in all that time, the building had never once been mistaken for somewhere you'd take someone you were trying to impress. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked and patched with electrical tape. The ceiling fan above the counter wobbled through every rotation like it was tired of its own existence. The coffee was bad enough that the regulars had stopped commenting on it years ago, the way you stop noticing a neighbor's ugly fence once it becomes part of the landscape. You just accepted it. You drank it anyway. Kellan Voss had been coming here 3, sometimes 4 nights a week for the past 2 years, ever since the repair yard on Dock Street started pulling him in for late shift emergencies. He always took the same booth far corner, back to the wall, seat facing the entrance. Not because he's being dramatic about it, just habit. Old habit, the kind that gets routed so deep into a man's wiring that he stops noticing he's doing it. He was 37 years old, though he looked a few years older than that, mostly around the eyes. Not from age exactly, but from a certain kind of accumulated weight, the weight of things that don't fully leave a man even after he stops actively carrying them. He was big without being theatrical about it, the kind of build that came from actual labor rather than a gym, wide through the shoulders, hands that were permanently stained at the knuckles from engine grease, no amount of scrubbing fully removed. His hair needed cutting. His jacket had a tear at the left elbow that he'd been meaning to patch for 6 weeks. He was on his second cup of coffee when the woman came in. She entered at 11:31 p.m. Kellan registered the time automatically without meaning to, and she did it in a way that was clearly calculated. No hesitation at the door. No scanning the room the way people do when they're looking for someone. She moved directly to the far corner booth on the opposite side of the diner, slid in with her back to the window, and kept her jacket on despite the fact that the Harbor Moon ran its heat about 10 degrees too high for anyone's comfort. She was young, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Dressed simply dark jeans, a gray fleece, nothing that suggested anything in particular about who she was. Her hair was pulled back in the kind of hasty knot people throw together when appearance isn't the priority. She set a plain canvas bag on the seat beside her, placed her phone face down on the table, and ordered decaf from Marta the waitress without making eye contact. She didn't pull out a laptop, didn't scroll through her phone. Just sat there with both hands wrapped around the mug Marta brought her, staring at the table surface, like she was having a very quiet, very private argument with herself. Kellan noticed her, the way he noticed everything, not staring, just cataloging. She was trying very hard not to be noticed, which was interesting, because most people who wanted to avoid attention either chose a place they were completely unknown, or they chose somewhere crowded enough that anonymity was structural. This woman had chosen a nearly empty diner at 11:30 on a Tuesday, which accomplished neither of those things particularly well. He went back to his coffee. Outside, rain was starting to work itself up against the windows, the slow, indifferent West Haven kind that came in off the harbor and settled in for the night, rather than burning itself out quickly. The counter radio was playing something instrumental that nobody was listening to. Marta was refilling ketchup bottles at the far end of the counter. An older couple 3 booths down was finishing their pie in comfortable silence. It was a Tuesday night in a waterfront diner, and then it wasn't. The door opened at 11:44, and the 4 men came in riding the particular energy that men carry after a night that's gone on longer than their judgment could handle. They were loud in the way that wasn't about being heard, it was about establishing that the room belonged to them now. The kind of loud that's really a question dressed up as a statement, testing whether anyone in the space is going to push back. The leader was tallest, mid-30s, dark jacket, with the collar up in a way that didn't suit him. He had the face of a man who'd gotten his way enough times that being told no had become genuinely foreign to him. His name was Trent Mallory, though Kellan didn't know that yet. Kellan watched them settle into the booth nearest the door. Watched the way they arranged themselves, not randomly, the way people sit when they're just trying to find seats, but with Trent Mallory positioning himself on the side that gave him the cleanest sightline to the rest of the diner. Like he was checking who was there, taking inventory. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. Not who had too much to drink wrong. Something else. Something sharper. Marta appeared with menus, deployed her professional-level neutrality, and retreated. Trent said something that made the others laugh. Then one of them, heavy-set, red-faced, sporting a watch that cost more than it needed, to look directly at the woman in the corner booth. The look lasted about 3 seconds too long. Kellan set down his coffee cup. The woman hadn't looked up. She was aware of them. He could see the slight shift in how she was holding herself, the way her hands moved her phone an inch closer, without making it obvious she'd done it. But she was making the calculation that most reasonable people make in this situation. Don't engage. Let it pass. They'll get bored. It wasn't a stupid calculation. It was usually correct. Hey. Trent Mallory's voice carried across the diner the way he intended it to. Not a shout, but projected. Aimed. We're friendly people. What's the problem? The woman did not look up. Rude, one of the others offered, with the particular tone of someone who enjoys narrating other people's behavior from the safety of a group. Kellan watched. His coffee was getting cold and he wasn't touching it. The older couple at the back booth had stopped eating their pie. Marta had gone very still behind the counter. The instrumental music from the radio filled the silence with something inappropriately cheerful. Trent Mallory got up. He crossed the diner with the slow, deliberate walk of a man who was certain nobody in the room was going to stop him, and he sat down in the seat directly across from the woman. Her canvas bag was in his way, so he shoved it sideways along the bench without looking at it, and he leaned forward with his elbows on the table and said, quietly enough that it didn't carry across the room, I'm just trying to be friendly. Is that so hard? The woman looked up for the first time. Her expression wasn't fear, exactly. It was something flatter and harder than fear, the face of someone running through options, assessing odds, keeping the exterior still while the interior worked fast. She said evenly, I'd like you to go back to your table. Yeah, I don't think I will. He smiled. Not the smile of someone who found something funny. The other kind. She reached for her phone. His hand came down on top of hers before she could close her fingers around it. Kellan was already out of his booth. He didn't hurry. Hurrying would have drawn everyone's attention before he'd figured out the geometry of the room, and he needed 3 more seconds to finish doing that. He walked the length of the diner the way someone walks when they're heading to the counter for a refill, unhurried, purposeful, headed somewhere, and he stopped about 2 feet from the booth where Trent Mallory was still leaning forward with his hand covering the woman's. Give it back, Kellan said. Trent turned his head and looked at Kellan the way men look at something they've already decided isn't a problem. He took in the worn jacket, the grease-stained hands, the general presentation of a man who fixed engines for a living and was probably exhausted, and whatever risk assessment he ran came back favorable for himself. Walk away, man, he said. This is a private conversation. The phone, Kellan said. Give it back to her. From across the diner, one of the others, the one nearest the door, made a sound of theatrical disbelief. You serious right now? Kellan didn't respond to that. He was watching Trent, specifically Trent's shoulders, and what Trent's right hand was doing, which was releasing the woman's phone and reaching toward the inner pocket of his jacket. There's nothing in that pocket you want to reach for, Kellan said quietly. Something in his voice made Trent pause. Not the words the register. The specific flatness of it. The way there was no anger in it, no bravado, nothing to argue against or escalate off of. Just a statement of fact, delivered by someone who had made statements of fact in much worse rooms than this one. Trent's hand stopped. The woman took her phone back from the table surface, slipped it under her leg, and stayed completely still. 4 of you, Kellan said, in the same quiet voice, and you're going to want to think carefully about the next 30 seconds, because however this goes from here, one of those 30 seconds ends with a police call, and then we're all going to be having a conversation that's going to be substantially less enjoyable for you than whatever you had planned tonight. You have any idea who I am? Trent said. I don't need to. That landed wrong for Trent. His jaw tightened. He slid out of the booth and stood up, and he had an inch on Kellan and 30 extra pounds. And he was the kind of man who had spent enough time using both facts that he'd come to think of them as leverage. He stepped forward. Kellan didn't step back. What happened next was so fast and so controlled that the older couple in the back booth actually didn't realize anything had happened until it was already over. Trent reached for Kellan's jacket lapel a grab, an attempt to establish physical dominance, and Kellan moved inside it, not backward, inside it, and used Trent's own forward momentum to redirect him sideways into the empty booth to his left. Hard enough to make the table slide 4 inches, but not hard enough to be what anyone would later call an assault. Trent hit the booth bench and sat down heavily, and stared up at Kellan with genuine surprise on his face. Pure, unfiltered surprise, like the ground had moved. From the door side of the diner, 2 of the others were already on their feet. Kellan turned 45 degrees, not to face them to keep both them and Trent in his peripheral line at once. He said almost conversationally, Marta, call it in. Marta, who had been standing frozen by the coffee station, picked up the landline. The 2 men from the door booth looked at each other. Looked at Trent, who was still processing what had happened to him. Looked at the 3rd man who hadn't moved. The 4th one tried. He was younger than the others, faster, and he committed to it, came around the end of the booth with real intent. Kellan sidestepped the angle, caught the man's leading arm at the wrist, and applied pressure at a specific point that made the man's knees buckle without Kellan appearing to have done anything in particular. The man folded sideways against the counter edge and stopped moving forward. Sit down, Kellan said to him. Not unkindly, the man sat down. Trent was back on his feet now, and the surprise had curdled into something uglier. His face had gone dark, and the way his hands were moving at his sides said he hadn't decided yet what to do with them. He looked at Kellan for a long moment, and then he looked at the woman in the corner booth, who was watching all of this from behind her coffee mug with her phone in her hand and her jacket zipped to the collar. Something crossed Trent's face, not anger, something more deliberate. He looked back at Kellan. You have absolutely no idea who she is, he said. It was not a taunt. That was the thing. It was delivered completely without heat, like a piece of information being deposited for future reference. Trent straightened his jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and turned toward the door. Let's go, he said to the others. They went. The diner door swung shut behind them. The rain outside had gotten serious, while nobody was paying attention to it. Kellan stood in the middle of the harbor moon and listened to the ceiling fan wobble overhead and waited for his pulse to come back down to where it belonged. Marta was still on the phone with dispatch. The older couple in the back had resumed their pie with the focused energy of people who had collectively decided not to have seen any of what they'd seen. Kellan turned around. The woman in the corner booth was looking at him. She had both hands flat on the table now. Her phone was face up and he could see from where he was standing that the screen was cracked. It must have happened when Trent grabbed it. She was breathing carefully, the kind of breathing that's a decision rather than an accident. Thank you, she said. You're all right? Yes. A pause. You didn't have to do that. No, Kellan agreed. He looked at the door, where the 4 men had gone. But I don't think they were here by accident. She said nothing for a moment. Then what do you mean? The way they came in, Kellan said. The one who sat across from you, he looked at you before he sat down. Not like he noticed you, like he was confirming something. He paused. And he went straight for your phone. Not your bag, not your cash. Your phone. The woman stared at him. Outside, sirens were starting somewhere a few blocks away, growing closer through the rain. Kellan picked up his jacket from his booth, left enough on the table to cover his coffee and Marta's trouble, and looked back at the woman in the corner. You want to tell me what's on it? He said. The phone. What were you carrying? The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone making a decision about how much of the truth to start with. The silence in the harbor moon stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Kellan hadn't moved from where he was standing. He wasn't pressing, or wasn't leaning in, or crossing his arms, or doing any of the things people do when they want someone to feel the weight of a question. He was simply standing there in the middle of the diner, with his jacket over one arm, Waiting, the way a man waits when he's genuinely comfortable with the possibility that the answer might be none of your business. Outside, the police cruiser pulled up to the curb. The lights swept through the diner windows in slow blue arcs. Marta was already moving toward the door. The woman looked at Kellan for another moment, assessing something. He could tell, though he couldn't have said exactly what, and then she looked down at her cracked phone screen and said quietly, "Sit down." Kellan sat down, not across from her. He took the chair at the end of the table, the one that put his back to the wall, and gave him a line of sight to both the entrance and the booth where she was sitting. She noticed that. He could see her notice it, the small recalibration that happened behind her eyes. "My name is Laurel Everhart," she said. She said it the way someone says a thing they've spent years, watching change the temperature of rooms flatly, without performance, watching his face for the reaction. Kellan gave her nothing in particular, because the name didn't immediately mean anything to him. He worked on marine engines. He didn't read the business section. "Okay," he said. Something loosened slightly in her posture. Not relief, exactly. More like the small adjustment that happens when a person realizes they don't need to brace for a specific thing. "Everhart Atlantic," she said. "You've seen the construction on the north waterfront? Hard to miss. That's us." She wrapped both hands around her mug again, though the coffee had gone cold. "We're acquiring and redeveloping most of West Haven's aging port district. It's a significant project." "I know the waterfront," Kellan said. "I repair the boats that work out of it." She nodded. "Then you know the dock workers, the independents, the guys who've been running cargo operations here for 20-30 years. Some of them. Then you might know that several of them have been getting squeezed out." She said it plainly, without the cushioning language people use when they're trying to manage how something lands. Subcontracted out of their positions and replaced with crews that nobody seems to know anything about. Cargo manifests that don't add up. Equipment charges for equipment that doesn't appear to exist. She paused. "I found out 3 weeks ago, from a source inside my own company." The two officers came through the door, rain-damp and businesslike, and Marta directed them toward Kellan and Laurel's area with the competent efficiency of a woman who has long since made her peace with West Haven's Friday night geography. The next 20 minutes were procedural statements, descriptions of Trent Mallory and the others, confirmation that they'd left before the cruiser arrived. One of the officers took down Kellan's account with the specific neutral expression of a cop who isn't sure yet whether the mechanic who allegedly redirected 2 grown men into furniture is a hero or a problem. Kellan kept his account clean and factual. He'd inserted himself into a situation involving a woman being physically blocked and having her property grabbed. He'd used the minimum necessary to resolve it. He hadn't thrown a punch. "The minimum necessary," the officer repeated. "That's right." The officer looked at him for a moment, then wrote something in his notebook that Kellan couldn't see and moved on. When they were gone, Laurel looked at Kellan across the table with an expression that had sharpened considerably since he'd sat down. "You know what the minimum necessary looked like to me?" she said. "Probably not very much. You moved like you'd done it before. Not bar fight done it before. The other kind." Kellan said nothing. "Military," she said. "That was a while ago. How long?" "Long enough." He looked at her. "You were saying." 3 weeks ago. A source inside your company. She accepted the redirect, though not without letting him know she'd noticed it. His name is Danny Reeves. He's worked the docks here for 11 years. He came to me directly, not to legal, not to HR, to me. Personally, he had copies of manifests, internal billing records. He'd been watching it for months before he pulled it together. She set her phone on the table between them, and Kellan could see that even with the cracked screen, there were images on it. Photographs of documents. He sent me these tonight, 2 hours before I came in here. Kellan looked at the images without picking up the phone. Even at a glance, the documents had the density of shipping records columns of numbers, cargo codes, dates, contractor names. "Tonight," he said. "He sent these tonight, and 2 hours later, 4 men came looking specifically for your phone." She looked at him steadily. "Yes. Who knew you were in West Haven?" "Nobody," I told. "I drove down from the regional office in Hargrove myself. No assistant, no driver. I checked into a motel under a name I use for travel that I'd rather not explain right now." She paused. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you were being careful." He looked at the door. "Not careful enough. Obviously, somebody tracked you. Or tracked Danny. She said it with the quiet weight of someone who'd been turning that thought over for the last 40 minutes and hadn't found a way to make it better. He works here, West Haven. If someone is watching him, if they were watching him when he sent these to me, they'd know you had them. Yes. Kellan was quiet for a moment. Through the diner window, the rain hammered the sidewalk, and the harbor beyond it was invisible in the dark. Just a presence suggested by the smell of salt and the sound of water moving against pilings. He thought about what Trent Mallory's face had looked like when he'd stood up from that booth. The specific flatness of it, the controlled way he'd delivered those parting words. You have absolutely no idea who she is, not a taunt. Not drunk bravado. A signal. You have no idea who she is, and therefore you have no idea what you just stepped into. He said something to me before he left, Kellan said. I heard it. That wasn't a man who was embarrassed about getting run out of a diner. That was a man who was logging information. He looked at her. You understand what I'm saying? He'll report back, Laurel said. He'll report back that you were in the diner, that you have the documents, that someone interfered. That's 3 pieces of information that whoever sent him is going to want. He paused. And one of those pieces of information is me. Laurel set down her mug. I'm sorry. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm saying that in approximately, he checked his watch, 45 minutes, somebody is going to know your documents weren't recovered, that the woman they were recovered from is still in West Haven, and that there was a man at the diner who involved himself. He looked at her steadily. If your source is who they're using to track you, he may not be safe tonight either. Laurel stared at him. Something shifted in her face, not panic. She wasn't the panic type. He was already fairly sure of that, but a specific kind of dread that comes with suddenly understanding that a situation you thought was bad has additional rooms to add to it. She reached for a cracked phone. Danny, she said, already dialing. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. She dialed again. 7 rings. Voicemail. She set the phone down on the table, and her hands weren't entirely steady when she did it. He always picks up, she said. Kellan was already pulling on his jacket. They found Danny Reeves's apartment on the south side of the Dock District, empty in the way that was worse than simply no one being home. The door was unlocked. The television was on, some late-night sports recap running to nobody. There was a half-finished bowl of noodles on the kitchen table, still faintly warm when Laurel touched the side of the bowl. His phone was on the counter, not lost or forgotten, but placed there deliberately, set face down in the careful way of someone who knows they're going somewhere a phone can be used to track them. Or someone took it away from him and left it there on purpose. Kellan stood in the center of the apartment and didn't touch anything else. He'd told Laurel not to touch anything either, and she'd complied without argument, which told him she was thinking clearly enough to override the instinct to do something in a room that was asking for a response. He's gone, she said. It wasn't a question. He left or was moved, Kellan said. We don't know which yet. If he left on his own, he'd have taken his phone. Not necessarily. Depends on how scared he was and who he was scared of. She looked at him from across the small kitchen. The overhead light was harsh and unflattering, and she'd been awake too long already, and none of that changed the fact that she was trying to think through it rather than just react to it, which Kellan found himself respecting despite himself. Who do I call? She said. The police were already at the diner. If I report a missing person who's been gone for maybe 2 hours on a night when I just filed a harassment report, they'll make the connection and it becomes a larger investigation that moves at police speed, Kellan said. Which is not necessarily bad, but it also announces to whoever is watching that you've escalated. And if he's somewhere safe? If he left on his own and I trigger a full investigation? Then he surfaces in a day or 2 and you explain it. He looked at the phone on the counter. The question is which risk you can live with. She thought about it for 4 seconds. He watched her think. I'll call the police, she said. Not because I'm certain, but because if I'm wrong and something happened to him, I don't want the reason it took too long to be that I was worried about optics. Kellan nodded. That was the right call and they both knew it. While she made the call, he walked through the apartment not searching, just reading the room. The noodle bowl, the television, the careful placement of the phone. The door that was unlocked but not kicked in, not forced. Whoever came for Danny Reeves, or wherever Danny Reeves went, It had happened fast, and it had happened quietly. That required planning. This wasn't opportunistic. None of it was. Not the diner, not the timing, not this apartment. Someone had Danny Reeves under surveillance, had likely identified that he'd sent documents to Laurel Everhart, had moved within 2 hours of that transmission. That was organizational speed. That was infrastructure. Kellan stood at Danny's kitchen window and looked out at the West Haven harbor, dark and rain-blurred and enormous, and he thought about the word that had been forming in the back of his mind since the moment he'd watched Trent Mallory choose a seat at the diner that gave him a clear sightline to the room. Somebody inside Everhart Atlantic was running this. Not a disgruntled employee skimming cargo invoices. Not small-time waterfront graft. The speed of response, the planning, the coordinated pressure on Laurel from multiple directions at once. This was someone with resources and authority and enough access to Laurel's movements that they could mobilize 4 men to a specific diner in under 2 hours. That someone was inside her organization. He turned away from the window. Laurel had finished her call and was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the small living room, her arms crossed over her chest, in the way people cross their arms when they're cold. And it has nothing to do with temperature. She was looking at the phone on the counter the same way she'd looked at the table in the diner, not seeing what was in front of her, but seeing what was behind it. The detective said they'd send someone, she said. He sounded like he was humoring me. They'll take it more seriously when they see the apartment. Maybe. She uncrossed her arms. I need to tell you something. Okay. I didn't come to West Haven just to look at construction sites, she said it levelly, without apology. I came because someone sent me information suggesting that money is moving through my company's waterfront operations in ways that shouldn't be possible without significant internal cooperation. Millions of dollars, Kellan. Not small amounts that could be misattributed to accounting errors. She held his gaze. Whoever is doing this has been doing it for a long time. Long enough that the paper infrastructure is deep and sophisticated, and designed specifically so that if it's ever discovered, the blame points in a particular direction. At you, Kellan said. She didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. Someone inside your organization is stealing from it, he said, and they've built the operation so that when it surfaces, you're the one holding the evidence of it. That's what the documents Danny sent me suggest. Yes. She said it with the flat steadiness of someone who has had 3 weeks to absorb a particular horror and has achieved a kind of grim equilibrium with it. Which means whoever sent those men tonight wasn't just trying to recover sensitive files. They were trying to recover the one thing that might help me prove I'm not the author of all of this. The rain hammered the window. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed. Kellan sat down at Danny Reeves's kitchen table, across from the half-finished bowl of noodles, and looked at Laurel Everhart standing in the doorway of her employee's abandoned apartment, and understood with the particular clarity that comes from having spent years in environments where the geometry of a problem had to be read fast, or people got hurt, exactly what kind of situation this was. She needed help. Not private security, not lawyers, not the kind of institutional response that moved in straight lines, while the person running this operation moved in circles around it. She needed someone who could read a room the way Trent Mallory's positioning at a diner table told a story, who understood how operations were built and where their pressure points were, who could work without making noise. He also had a 9-year-old daughter who was asleep right now at his neighbor Mrs. Pollock's house because Mrs. Pollock watched Sadie on late shift nights, and Sadie had a school day tomorrow and a science project due Thursday that she'd been working on for 2 weeks, and a dentist appointment at 4 on Friday that Kellan had rescheduled once already and felt terrible about. I'm going to be honest with you, Kellan said. Laurel waited. 2 years ago, I would have already told you what I think needs to happen next and how to make it happen. I did work that required a particular set of skills, and I was good at it. He paused. I left that work because staying in it was costing me something I couldn't get back. My daughter lost her mother when she was 7. She's 9 now. I made her a promise about what her life was going to look like. Laurel was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to go back to whatever that was. I know you're not. I'm asking you to help me figure out who in my organization is doing this and how to stop them. That's all. That's not a small thing. No, she agreed. It's not. She sat down across from him at the table. I'm not going to pretend I can't see what I'm asking. You pulled 4 men off me tonight because you couldn't watch what was happening and do nothing. I'm aware that telling you about this situation is doing something similar. She met his eyes directly. You can say no. I'll figure it out another way. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw in that diner, or that I don't know what it means. Kellan looked at the bowl of noodles going cold between them. He thought about Danny Reeves's phone, placed face down on the counter. The deliberateness of it. The man had been scared enough to leave a meal half-eaten, but careful enough to think about the phone before he went wherever he went. That was someone who was trying to stay alive. I'm not making any commitments tonight, Kellan said finally. But tell me everything you know about who has access to your travel schedule. Something shifted in Laurel's face, not relief, not quite, but the particular expression of a person who has been holding a weight alone long enough that even the possibility of someone else's hands on it produces a physical response. Everything, she said. Start with your executive team, Kellan said. And tell me which of them has been with the company long enough to build something like this without you noticing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said a name. Blaine Corbett, she said. My executive vice president. He's been with Everhard Atlantic for 9 years. Before me. She paused. He knows every corner of that company. Every contract, every relationship, every inspector we work with on the waterfront. Another pause, longer this time. And 2 weeks ago, when I told him I was concerned about some of the contractor billings, he offered to look into it himself. The rain kept coming down outside. Kellan looked at her across the table. What did you tell him? I said I'd handle it, she said. And then Danny Reeves sent you those photographs, and you drove down to West Haven yourself, at night, without telling anyone.
Yes.
And tonight, 4 hours after you arrived, 4 men found you in a diner you chose at random. Laurel held his gaze. Yes. Neither of them said what that meant. They didn't need to. Outside, the harbor was dark, and the rain didn't care about any of it. And somewhere in West Haven, a man named Danny Reeves was either hiding or not, and a man named Blaine Corbett was either sleeping or waiting to hear from Trent Mallory. And none of the pieces had fully assembled themselves into a picture yet, but the outline was there. Kellan pulled out his own phone and texted Mrs. Pollock. Sadie all right? Working late. The reply came back in 30 seconds. Asleep 2 hours ago. Ate 3 fish sticks and a mountain of applesauce. She's fine. He put the phone back in his jacket pocket. All right, he said. Start from the beginning. Everything Blaine Corbett has had access to in the last 18 months. Don't edit it for what you think matters. I'll sort that part. Laurel straightened slightly in the chair, organized herself. And then she started talking, and the rain kept working against the windows of Danny Reeves's quiet apartment, and the television in the next room murmured the scores of games nobody was watching, and the bowl of noodles went fully cold between them. Kellan drove home at 2:15 in the morning, through streets that were mostly empty and entirely rain-soaked, the harbor district sliding past his windows in smears of orange streetlight and dark water. He kept the radio off. He needed to think in silence, and the silence in his truck was the good kind, not the hollow kind that had followed him around for the first year after Claire died, the kind that felt like something missing, but the working kind, the kind that had a texture to it. He'd spent 2 hours in Danny Reeves's apartment listening to Laurel Everhart dismantle her own company for him. Not defensively, not with the careful management of someone trying to control a narrative. She'd laid it out methodically. The way someone presents a problem they genuinely want solved rather than explained away. Names, dates, contractor relationships, billing structures. 9 years of Blaine Corbett's fingerprints on the operational architecture of Everhart Atlantic's waterfront division. She'd been thorough, and she'd been honest about the gaps in what she knew, which Kellan found more useful than the facts themselves. The gaps were where the structure lived. He'd listened without taking notes, which she'd found disconcerting, until she understood that he wasn't going to forget any of it. By the time he pulled into the narrow driveway beside his house on Calloway Street, he had a working map of the thing in his head. Not complete, nowhere close to complete, but enough to know that Blaine Corbett hadn't built this in a weekend. This was years of patient, careful architecture. Fake subcontractors with real-looking paper trails. Cargo inspection records that had been altered with enough sophistication to pass casual scrutiny. a financial drainage system embedded so deeply inside legitimate operations that pulling it out without destroying the surrounding structure would require surgical precision. And the exit strategy: frame the CEO. That was the part that had kept Kellan quiet for a long moment in Danny Reeves's kitchen. Not because it was surprising in the abstract. It was a predictable play, but because of how long Blaine Corbett must have been cultivating it. Every piece of false documentation pointed at decisions that nominally traced back to Laurel's office. The timing of the contractor approvals, the way the billing anomalies clustered around periods when Laurel was traveling and signing off on executive summaries rather than granular reports. Blaine had been building the frame for at least 3 years. Probably longer. That wasn't opportunism. That was a man who had decided something and then committed to it completely. Kellan sat in his truck for a few minutes after he cut the engine, just looking at his house. The porch light was on. He left it on when he worked late, some leftover habit from years of coming home to Claire, who always left it on for him, and he hadn't been able to stop. The rest of the house was dark. Inside, Mrs. Pollock was asleep on the couch. She had a key, and she stayed over on late nights rather than walking home after midnight, and he paid her double for those nights, though she always argued about it. Sadie's window was the second one on the left, dark. Curtains with the small printed stars that she'd picked out herself insisted on, even though they were technically sold as toddler curtains, because she liked the stars regardless of what age they were marketed to. He went inside, moved quietly through the living room past Mrs. Pollock's sleeping form, and stopped in the hallway outside Sadie's room. He didn't open the door, didn't want to risk. Waking her, just stood there for a moment in the dark hallway, with one hand against the doorframe, listening to the small sounds of a child sleeping in the next room. He'd made her a promise, not in words or not only in words, in the particular way that promises get made to 9-year-olds who've already lost one parent in the structure of daily life, in the consistency of being there, in the 1,000 small acts of showing up that accumulate into something a child can trust. You couldn't undo that promise with an explanation. Kids didn't work that way. Kids worked on evidence. He went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well. The next morning, he dropped Sadie at school. She spent the entire drive telling him about a documentary she'd seen at Mrs. Pollock's about deep-sea fish that produced their own light, which she found both fascinating and troubling in equal measure. And then he drove to the public library on Harbor Street and used one of the computers in the reference section. He spent 2 hours pulling everything publicly available on Everhard Atlantic, Blaine Corbett, and the specific subcontractors whose names Laurel had mentioned. Public records, corporate filings, property records in the Port District. News archives going back 6 years. He was systematic about it, the way he'd been trained to be systematic, building a picture from available information before asking the questions that available information couldn't answer. What he found confirmed the outline Laurel had given him and added texture to it. 3 of the subcontractors, she'd named the ones whose billing records showed the largest anomalies, had been incorporated within 18 months of each other. All registered through the same filing agent in a different state, all with the same generic structure of shell within shell that made beneficial ownership genuinely difficult to trace. On paper, they looked independent. In practice, the formation dates and structural similarities suggested a single hand behind all 3. Blaine Corbett's name appeared nowhere in connection with them. But a name appeared twice in separate articles about waterfront development contracts from 4 years ago, a project manager who'd been brought in by Everhard Atlantic to oversee a dock renovation that had gone significantly over budget. The project manager's name was Ray Sutter, and he didn't work for Everhard Atlantic anymore, and the dock renovation had concluded with a reconciliation report that attributed the overrun to unforeseen structural complications. The reconciliation report had been signed off by Blaine Corbett. Kellan wrote down Ray Sutter's name in the margin of the notepad he'd borrowed from the library desk and circled it twice. He drove to the repair yard because he still had a job and a shift that started at 11, and he spent 4 hours on a diesel inboard that was giving its owner all kinds of grief. And he thought about Blaine Corbett the way he used to think about operational problems, not obsessively, but consistently, turning the shape of it in the back of his mind while his hands did the mechanical work his hands knew how to do. By 3 o'clock, he'd identified 3 things he needed to know that he couldn't find in public records. And by 3:30, He'd thought of 2 ways to find them without announcing himself. He texted Laurel, "Need 2 things from you. Direct access to contractor billing files from the past 4 years. And a name, Ray Sutter. What do you know about him?" Her response came 12 minutes later. "Sutter. Left the company 3 years ago. Blaine handled his exit. I was told it was mutual." "Where did you find that name?" "Public record. The dock renovation from 4 years ago. He and Blaine signed off on the same project." A pause. Longer than her previous response times. "Kellan. I've been looking at the internal files this morning. Danny's manifests, I can read them now that I know what I'm looking for. The shell companies he identified. One of them has a registered agent address that matches an address in old correspondence I found in Blaine's shared project folder. From 6 years ago. Send it to me, not by email. Where can I meet you?" He thought for a moment. Harbor Street Library. 6 o'clock. Use the side entrance. She was there at 5:50, which he noted without comment. She'd changed from the previous night dark trousers, a plain button-down, her hair down, and she came in through the side door and found him at a table in the back corner of the reading room, with the focused efficiency of someone who'd spent time in environments where being conspicuous was a problem. She sat down and slid a folded printout across the table without preamble. He looked at it. The correspondence was 6 years old, an email chain between Blaine Corbett and a property management entity discussing the setup of billing arrangements for a new contractor relationship. The property management entity's registered address was on it. It matched one of the subsidiary addresses tied to the shell companies in Danny's manifests. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a thread. But it was a thread that Blaine Corbett hadn't been careful enough to pull, because it was 6 years old and he'd probably stopped thinking about it. "How many people in your company have access to Blaine's old project files?" Kellan asked. "Technically, the executive server is accessible to the full executive team." In practice, she stopped. In practice, no one goes into another executive's project folders unless there's a reason. It's not a formal restriction, it's just not done. So Blaine wouldn't know you pulled this. Not unless he's monitoring server access in real time. Which he might be. I don't know the full scope of what he's set up. Kellan folded the printout and put it in his jacket pocket. "I need to make contact with Ray Sutter." Laurel looked at him. "He's been out of the company for 3 years. If Blaine managed his exit, then he's either complicit or he's scared," Kellan said. "Either way, he knows something." He paused. "Do you have an address?" "HR records." "Yes, I can pull it." "Don't pull it from the office system. If Blaine has any kind of alert set on employee records, looking up a former employee who connects to those projects." "I have a personal contact in HR," she said. "Someone who isn't connected to any of this. I can ask informally. Do it carefully." She gave him a slightly dry look. "I've been running a company for 4 years. I know how to have a careful conversation." He took that. Fair enough. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the table surface. Around them, the reading room offered the muffled, focused quiet of a place where people came to think. An elderly man, 2 tables over, was working through a large print crossword with a dedicated pencil and a dedicated frown. A teenager near the window was attempting to look like she was doing homework while doing something else on her phone. "Danny still hasn't surfaced," Laurel said. It came out quieter than her other statements. "Not professional quiet, the other kind. I know. I checked the police report status this morning. They're treating it as a voluntary absence. He's an adult with no indicators of risk. He left no signs of a struggle." She paused. "They're not wrong about the signs. But they don't have the context. We can give them the context when we have something that forces them to take it seriously. Right now we have a missing man and some financial anomalies that a defense attorney would spend 30 minutes dismantling."
"I know."
She said it with the particular flatness of someone who understood the logic completely and hated it completely. "Kellan. He has 2 kids, Danny Reeves, a girl who's 11 and a boy who just turned 8. Kellan said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that. It just sat there between them on the library table with the weight it deserved. "I'm not walking away from it," he said finally. "I'm saying we build it right so it holds." She nodded. Once. The nod of someone who needs to believe something and has decided to go ahead and believe it. Ray Sutter lived in a rented duplex in the Millhaven neighborhood in the Millhaven neighborhood on the western edge of West Haven, the part of the city that was past the reach of the waterfront development money and looked like it was going to stay that way for a while. Kellan drove past it twice before he stopped, which was less about caution than about wanting to read the block. It was a quiet street, mostly older residents, a few kids' bikes chained to porch railings. He knocked on the door at 7:30 that evening, which he'd calculated as the likeliest time for a former project manager with no indicated employment to be home and sober enough to have a useful conversation. The man who answered was mid-50s, thick through the middle, in the way of someone who'd once been heavier and had lost some of it without quite restructuring the rest. He had the particular wariness of someone who has been waiting for a knock they didn't want for a long time and has gotten used to answering doors with a prepared face. He looked at Kellan without saying anything. "Ray Sutter," Kellan said. "Depends who's asking. My name's Kellan Voss. I repair marine engines out of the Dock Street yard. I'm not with law enforcement, I'm not with Everhard Atlantic, and I'm not here to cause you trouble." He paused. "I'm trying to understand what happened to a man named Danny Reeves, and I think you might be able to help me with that even, if you don't know you can." Something moved across Sutter's face at the name. Not surprise recognition. The kind that comes with an attached weight. "I don't know any Danny Reeves," he said. "I think you do," Kellan said. Not aggressively, just as a fact. "And I think the reason you're going to tell me you don't is the same reason you left Everhard Atlantic 3 years ago in what Blaine Corbett called a mutual separation." Sutter's jaw tightened. 5 minutes, Kellan said. "You can leave the door open. You can have your phone in your hand the whole time. 5 minutes, and then I'm gone either way." Sutter stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at Kellan the way people look at something that represents a calculation they've been avoiding. Then he stepped back and held the door open. The inside of the duplex was neat in the specific way of someone who lives alone and has arranged their space around themselves rather than anyone else, functional. A little sparse, the television on to fill the quiet. Sutter sat in an armchair and Kellan sat on the couch, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "He's missing," Kellan said. "Danny Reeves. He supplied documents to someone who was looking into irregularities in the waterfront operations, and he's been gone since Tuesday night." Sutter's hands were folded in his lap. He looked at them. "I don't know what you expect me to tell you," he said. "Whatever you know about what Blaine Corbett built into that company," Kellan said. "I don't think you built it with him. I think you were there long enough to see pieces of it, and when you saw enough, he made it easier for you to leave than to stay." The silence in the duplex had a quality to it. Outside, someone's television was audible through the shared wall, a game show, the sound of an audience reacting to something. "He didn't threaten me," Sutter said finally, without looking up. "Not directly, he's too smart for that." He paused. "He just made it clear that the documentation around the Belhaven Dock project, where I'd signed off on materials charges that I'd been told were legitimate, could be read in a way that made me look like I knew they weren't." Another pause. "I didn't know, but I'd signed off on them. My name was on it." "So you left." "I left. He gave me a reference letter that said nothing useful and nothing damaging, and I collected 11 weeks of severance, and I have not spoken about any of it since." Kellan looked at him steadily. "I need to know whether the documentation they used to back those materials charges the Belhaven suppliers, matches the structure of the entities I'm going to describe to you." He described 3 of the shell companies from Danny's manifests. The registration structure, the billing format, the specific way the contractor relationships were written into the project records. Sutter's expression, as Kellan talked, went through several things that Kellan watched without commenting on. When he finished, Sutter was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's the same structure." He said it with the specific exhaustion of a man setting down something he's carried for 3 years, without being able to put it down until someone offered him somewhere to set it. Same template, same spacing on the tax ID numbers. Even the same font in the invoice headers. I noticed that at the time and told myself I was being paranoid. He looked up. "Is the woman in trouble?" "The CEO, Everhart. She's working on it," Kellan said. "But yes, Blaine Corbett has had years to build this around her." Sutter nodded slowly. "He's patient," he said. "You have to understand that about him. He doesn't react to things. He positions himself around where things are going to happen, and he waits." He paused. "He's been planning to be rid of her since before she was appointed." I heard things when I was still there about how the company was supposed to go in a different direction when the previous leadership stepped down, and how Blaine was passed over, and how he handled that. He met Kellan's eyes. He handled it by smiling and shaking her hand and starting to build a way out the next Monday morning. Kellan drove home that night, with Sutter's statement recorded on his phone. The man had agreed to it. After Kellan explained what they were building toward, and a clearer picture of Blaine Corbett than he'd had that morning. Not a complete picture, but enough. He was 3 blocks from his house when his phone rang. The number was blocked. He answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was calm and pleasant and entirely without heat, the way certain dangerous things are without heat. "Mr. Voss," the voice said, "my name isn't important. What's important is that you understand that the situation you've involved yourself in is significantly more layered than the woman who recruited you has indicated. And that your daughter's school, Harrow Elementary, yes, is a place you'd prefer to remain uncomplicated for her." Kellan pulled to the curb and stopped the truck. His hands on the wheel were completely still. "She's in Mrs. Campton's class," the voice continued pleasantly. "3rd grade. She usually arrives around 8:15. You drop her off yourself most mornings." Kellan said nothing. The silence was the kind that had weight in it, and he was aware enough of himself to know that what was happening behind his eyes right now was something he needed to keep entirely off his voice. "I'd encourage you to think carefully," the voice said, "about what you're doing and who it's for. Good night, Mr. Voss." The call ended. Kellan sat at the curb on the empty street for 90 seconds, doing the thing he'd learned to do in situations that produced the particular cold fury that was moving through him right now. He breathed through it, identified it accurately, set it aside from his decision-making. Fury was information. It was not a plan. He called Mrs. Pollock from the curb and confirmed that Sadie was home, and everything was fine, and he'd be there in 10 minutes. Then he called Laurel. She picked up on the second ring. "Someone just told me what grade my daughter is in," he said. A beat of silence. "Kellan, I'm not backing out," he said. "I need you to understand that clearly. I'm not backing out. But we're changing how we approach this. 'Cause whoever made that call has access to information about my personal life that they got fast, which means either Blaine Corbett has more of an infrastructure around this than we realized, or Trent Mallory's been doing background on me since Tuesday night. Or both," Laurel said quietly. "Or both." He looked through his windshield at the streetlight making yellow circles in the wet pavement. "Sadie goes to my brother-in-law in Decatur tomorrow. He doesn't know why. He won't ask." He paused. "And then we need to move faster than we've been moving." "I agree," Laurel said. "Kellan, I know. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't need to be anything," he said. "We just need to build this right and build it fast." He paused. "Get me everything you have on Blaine Corbett's calendar for the past 6 months. Meeting records, travel, anything that shows his pattern. I want to know where he goes when he's not in the office. I can have it by tomorrow morning." "Good." He started the truck. "And Laurel." "Yes. When this is over," he said, "I'm going to need you to understand something. Not tonight, but eventually." He paused. "What they did tonight, bringing my daughter into it, that's the kind of line that doesn't get crossed without consequences. I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it so you understand what kind of person you're working with and what the limits of my patience actually are." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I understand," she said. He drove the rest of the way home in silence, parked in his driveway, and sat for a moment looking at the porch light he'd left on. The house was quiet. Inside, Sadie was doing whatever Sadie did, before she fell asleep, probably reading the library book about deep-sea creatures she'd been working through this week, with the flashlight she thought he didn't know she kept under her pillow. He'd seen what the wrong kind of fear did to children. He wasn't going to let that happen to her. He went inside. The next morning, he drove Sadie to school and watched her disappear through the front doors of Harrow Elementary, backpack bouncing, stopping once at the entrance to turn and wave at him with the complete physical commitment to a wave that only children managed, full body and entirely unself-conscious. He waved back. He sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes after she went inside, watching the entrance with the same quality of attention he'd once brought to watching building approaches in environments where the stakes of inattention were absolute. Then his phone buzzed, a news alert pushed to him by an app he kept for the local West Haven news. He read it, read it again. The headline was, West Haven Incident, Assault Claim Filed Against Local Mechanic Following Late-Night Confrontation. The article was brief and pointed and included a still image from the Harbor Moon security camera, edited. He could tell immediately, cropped and framed to show only the moment when Kellan had redirected the man into the booth, cut before the context of what preceded it, cut in a way that made the scene read as an unprovoked attack rather than what it had been. Trent Mallory had filed a complaint, and someone had gotten the camera footage, edited it, and fed it to the local news inside 48 hours. Kellan read the article to the end, where it noted that the management of the Dock Street repair yard was aware of the incident and had declined to comment. He closed the app, looked through his windshield at the entrance of his daughter's school, and understood that the next phase of this had already started without him. He called the repair yard. His foreman, a blunt, fair man named Walt Greer, who'd never given Kellan anything but talk, picked up and said, "Before Kellan could speak, I need you to come in, Kellan. Not for work. We need to talk." Kellan already knew what the conversation was going to be about. He drove to the yard. He had the conversation. By 10:30 that morning, he no longer had a job. Walt Greer sat across from him in the small, glass-walled foreman's office, with the expression of a man who was doing something that felt wrong and knew it, and had calculated that he didn't have a better option. And he said, "It's not about what I believe happened. You understand that. It's about what it looks like, and the yard can't have the liability exposure while the complaint is active." Kellan said he understood. He did understand. It didn't make it easier. He cleared his tools from his locker, shook Walt's hand at the door, and drove away from the Dock Street repair yard in the gray West Haven morning with the particular internal quiet of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do next and is done negotiating with himself about it. He called Laurel from the parking lot of a gas station on Harbor Road. "They took my job," he said when she picked up. A pause. "Kellan, it doesn't change anything. I just need you to know we're past the point where I had options about this. Blaine Corbett just made this personal in a way that's going to be difficult for him." He paused. "Send Sadie's school an anonymous tip about a suspicious vehicle in the parking lot. I'll text you the description. It'll get extra patrols out there without involving her directly. Okay, what else? Pull everything on Corbett's schedule. And find out if he's made contact with anyone in the media in the past 72 hours. Someone fed that footage to the news, and they knew exactly how to cut it. That's not Trent Mallory working alone. I'll find out," she said. "And Laurel." He looked at the gas station windows, where a tired-looking woman was paying for coffee and something wrapped in plastic. "Whatever Blaine Corbett has planned next, it's going to be bigger than a media story and a lost job. He moved fast because we got close. When people like him move fast, they make mistakes." He paused. "We need to be positioned to catch them when he does." The morning spread out gray and damp around him, and somewhere across the city, Sadie was in her classroom learning something about the world, and Danny Reeves was still missing, and Blaine Corbett was somewhere in a clean office doing the patient, careful work of a man who had spent 9 years making sure that whatever happened next, none of it could be traced back to him in any way that mattered. And Kellan Voss, unemployed as of 45 minutes ago, started his truck and drove toward whatever came next. The plan was Laurel's idea. Kellan didn't love it. He said so, directly, sitting across from her at the small table in the motel room she'd moved to after the Harbor Moon, a different motel, a different part of the city, paid in cash with the printouts and timeline documents spread between them and the afternoon light coming flat and gray through the curtain gap. "You're proposing to walk into a situation that he controls," Kellan said. "I'm proposing to let him think he controls it," Laurel said. "There's a difference. In theory. In practice, if we execute it correctly." He looked at her. She'd been awake since 5 that morning. He could see it in the particular tension around her eyes, the way she was holding her coffee cup in both hands, not for warmth, but for something to hold on to, and she still had the focused, unbothered quality of someone who ran on less sleep than most people needed and had made peace with that fact years ago. "Walk me through it again," he said. She set down the coffee. "Blaine needs 2 things right now. He needs the documents Danny sent me, because they're the only physical thread that connects the shell company structure to anything traceable. And he needs them isolated, removed from the investigation, discredited, or scared enough to back down." She paused. "We give him the second thing, publicly." I call a press statement. I announce that I've reviewed the situation and found that the evidence against Kellan Voss is credible, and that I'm removing him from any association with the internal review and stepping back myself to allow an independent examination. You announce that I deceived you, Kellan said. Yes. And you think Blaine believes it. Blaine wants to believe it. That's different, and it's more useful. She looked at him steadily. He's been watching this situation tighten around him for 72 hours. The media story, the assault complaint, the financial pressure on the repair yard, he pushed on all of those levers, expecting you to fold or Laurel Everhart to make a protective decision that pulled her back into defensible territory. If instead I appear to do exactly that, it confirms the narrative he's been building. The rogue operative, the naive CEO who got used, the investigation that collapses under its own lack of credibility. And he relaxes, Kellan said. He relaxes enough to move. He's been sitting on an exit strategy, some final transfer of documentation that completes the frame around me before he can disappear from it cleanly. He needs me discredited before that move, because discredited targets don't get believed when they start making accusations. She picked up one of the printouts from the table. Ray Sutter gave you the timeline. Blaine's calendar shows 2 foreign travel bookings in the next 3 weeks, both to jurisdictions with limited extradition cooperation. He's not taking a vacation. Kellan looked at the calendar she'd pulled. The bookings were there. They'd found them in Blaine Corbett's executive travel records, which Laurel had accessed through the company's administrative system with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd finally stopped being careful about what Blaine might notice and started being more concerned about what they needed to know. So he's moving, Kellan said. He was already moving before Tuesday. Tuesday accelerated the timeline. If he thinks I've pulled back, he'll move faster and with less caution. She set the printout down. We need him to arrange a meeting. Something private. Something where he thinks he has full control of the environment. We give him a reason to offer one. You contact him directly. I contact him, and I tell him I've found information suggesting that the documents Danny Reeves sent me were fabricated, that someone set Blaine up to look implicated, that I owe him an apology, and I'd like to discuss it privately before I make any statement to the board. She held Kellan's gaze. He won't be able to resist that. It gives him the opportunity to hear exactly what I think I know, and to shape what I think I know before I say it publicly. And it gives him the opportunity to eliminate the problem at the source, Kellan said flatly. Yes, Laurel said with the same flatness, which is why you'll be there. The silence between them had a particular quality. Outside the motel window, West Haven moved through its afternoon with no particular interest in either of them. You've thought about this for a while, Kellan said. Since 3 this morning. He looked at the documents spread across the table. The shell company structures, the billing records, the timeline of Blaine Corbett's patient, methodical construction of a 9-year exit. The calendar with its 2 quiet foreign travel bookings that didn't look like anything unless you were already looking. I have one condition, he said. Tell me, the investigators, whoever we bring in to monitor the meeting, they need to be in position before any contact is made with Blaine. Not after. Before. Because once he gets Laurel's message, he'll sweep the location. She nodded. I have someone. A former colleague from the Regulatory Compliance Office at the State Commerce Department. She's been waiting for something like this. For 2 years, she told me 6 months ago that the waterfront development numbers looked wrong and that nobody was willing to push on it. I didn't listen hard enough. She said it without deflection. Just as a fact. She can bring in 2 investigators from the State Financial Crimes Unit. Off book until we have cause to bring them formally. How do you know they won't tip it? Because the tip would go to Blaine's contacts in the regulatory apparatus. And my colleague's relationship with those investigators is specifically because they've been building cases that Blaine's contacts have been quietly shutting down for 3 years. She met his eyes. They want him. They just haven't had evidence that holds. Kellan was quiet for a long moment. What's the location? He said. That's his choice. We make the contact and we let him choose where. She paused. I'd expect somewhere he knows well. Somewhere he's identified as controllable. Kellan thought about the pier district he'd been studying for the past 2 days. The old Everhart Atlantic storage infrastructure along the north waterfront that was slated for renovation and was currently sitting empty and accessible and known in detail to anyone with 9 years inside the company's operational files. Pier 19, he said. Laurel looked at him. He'll choose Pier 19, Kellan said. It's the one piece of the waterfront infrastructure that Everhard Atlantic owns outright, that's been under renovation hold for 6 months, that has no active workers, and that Blaine has visited 3 times in the past month according to the access logs you pulled. He paused. He's already scouted it. He's already comfortable with it. She considered that. Then we need to know that building. I've been studying it since yesterday. She looked at him for a moment. When did you sleep? Enough, he said, which was not an answer, and they both knew it. The next 48 hours were the kind that compress in memory, not because nothing happened, but because everything that happened was preparation, which has a different texture than action. Laurel made her press statement on Thursday morning. It was measured and carefully worded, and it said, in the polished language of corporate communication, exactly what they wanted Blaine Corbett to hear, that she had reviewed the situation, that the evidence regarding Kellan Voss raised serious questions about the integrity of the information she'd been given, and that she was stepping back from any personal involvement in the matter while an independent review was conducted. She watched the statement go out from the motel room, and then she put her phone face down on the table and sat quietly for a moment, in a way that Kellan noticed and didn't comment on. It's the right call, he said. I know it is. She picked up her coffee. It still feels like something I don't want to be saying. Good, he said. If it felt easy, I'd be more worried about whether you'd sell it convincingly. She gave him a dry look that contained, under the dryness, something that might have been gratitude for the specific kind of honesty. Blaine Corbett responded to her message at 9:47 that night. She'd sent it through the company's internal messaging system, personal, direct, with the careful tone of someone who was embarrassed and trying to repair a relationship. His response was warm, in the way that certain cold things could be warm on the surface, expressing concern for her, relief that she'd reached out, and suggesting that yes, of course, they should speak privately before any board communication. He proposed a location for the following night. He said he wanted somewhere they wouldn't be overheard or interrupted, somewhere they could speak openly. He proposed Pier 19. Kellan read the message over her shoulder and said nothing. He'd expected it, but expectation and confirmation were different things, and confirmation of something that means a person has been thinking about you as a problem to be solved had a particular coldness to it, regardless of how ready you were for it. Tomorrow night, Laurel said. 11 o'clock, Kellan said, reading the proposed time. He wants late. Less traffic, less witness opportunity. He straightened up. We need to move. What followed was the kind of coordination that Kellan ran in his head the way he'd once run operational logistics, not written down, not diagrammed, held in the working architecture of a mind that had been trained to hold complex moving pieces in simultaneous awareness. He contacted Laurel's colleague from the Commerce Department, a sharp-eyed woman named Greta Hansen, who spoke in precise minimal sentences and had the specific patience of someone who had been building towards something for a long time. She confirmed the 2 investigators. She confirmed their positioning plan. After Kellan walked her through the pier's layout from the architectural records he'd pulled from the city's building database. He spent Thursday afternoon at Pier 19 himself, on foot, in the gray daylight, wearing the work jacket and carrying the tool bag that made him look like any of the maintenance contractors who'd been in and out of the waterfront district for months. The warehouse at the end of the pier was enormous, and mostly empty high ceilings, concrete floors, the smells of salt and old machinery, and the particular cold that comes from a large space that hasn't been consistently heated. He walked every corner of it, found the maintenance passage on the north wall, a narrow access corridor that ran behind the old equipment bays and connected to the pier's original service entrance on the harbor side. It was unlocked. It was unlocked because it had been unlocked for 6 months, and nobody had gotten around to securing it during the renovation hold. He noted 3 positions where the investigators could be concealed with audio range. He noted 2 exit routes that weren't the main entrance. He noted the overhead lighting grid, which ran on a single breaker panel in the east corridor and could be killed from one location. He did not tell Laurel all of this in detail. He told her what she needed to know, which was that he would be inside before she arrived, and that her job was to keep Blaine talking long enough for the recording equipment to capture what they needed. How long, she asked, as long as you can manage. He's going to be careful at first. He'll feel the room, look for indicators. Kellan paused. He'll relax when he's convinced himself he's the only one there who knows what's happening. That's when he'll start confirming things. And if he doesn't, she said, if he decides it's not worth the conversation and just, then you get out the same way we practiced, Kellan said. Fast, straight to the car, don't stop. The investigators are in position to call it in the moment anything physical starts. She nodded. She was doing the thing she did when she was managing fear, which he'd identified 2 days ago, the slight, controlled evenness of her breathing, the way she kept her hands visible rather than folding them, the conscious settling of her expression into something that looked calmer than whatever was actually happening underneath it. She wasn't fearless. She was working, and fear was one of the things she was working around. He respected it more than fearlessness, frankly. Fearlessness in situations like this was usually a liability. There's something else, she said. He waited. The recorder. She touched the small device clipped inside the collar of her jacket, a secondary unit, different from the primary that Greta's team would be monitoring. If the primary feed is compromised, it's a backup, Kellan said. Insurance. He'll find the primary. I think he'll find it. She held his gaze. He's thorough. He's had 9 years of being thorough. If he sweeps me before we get into the conversations, then the backup is what matters, Kellan said. And it stays hidden because it's smaller than anything he'll be looking for, and it's positioned where he won't think to look.
How sure are you?
He paused for a moment because she deserved a real answer rather than a reassuring one. Reasonably sure, he said. Not completely sure. There isn't a version of this that's completely sure, Laurel. You know that, she was quiet. Yes, I know that. Do you want to pull it? No, she said without hesitation. I want to finish it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, and they went back to the work. Friday night came in cold off the harbor, the kind of cold that had salt in it and purpose, and Pier 19 sat at the end of its concrete approach, looking exactly like what it was, a large, empty, imperfectly lit industrial space that nobody was supposed to be in. Kellan was inside by 9:15. He'd entered through the harborside service entrance, moved through the maintenance passage in the dark, with a small flashlight held low, and found the position he'd selected the day before, a raised equipment platform on the west wall, partially screened by a rusted structural support with a clear sightline to the main floor and the entrance doors. He was still. The cold didn't bother him particularly. He'd been still in worse places and colder ones. At 10:40, Greta Hansen's voice came through the earpiece he was wearing, minimal, just a single bead unit, barely visible. Team is in position, north and south, audio is live. Copy, he said very quietly. At 10:53, headlights swept across the high windows on the east wall. A vehicle on the pier approach. That's Laurel, Greta said. Kellan watched the main doors. Laurel came in at 10:55, exactly as planned 5 minutes early, enough time to establish herself in the space before Blaine arrived, not enough time to look like she'd been there arranging things. She came through the main entrance, let the door close behind her, and stood in the center of the main floor under the inadequate overhead lighting, with her jacket zipped and her hands at her sides. She didn't look for him. She knew where he was, and she didn't look for him, which was the right call. She waited. Blaine Corbett arrived at 11:02. He came through the main entrance with 2 men, not Trent Mallory, different ones, bigger and quieter, and Kellan registered this with the cold precision of recalibrating a calculation that had been based on slightly different numbers. 2 men. He'd planned for the possibility of 2 men. He watched Blaine from the platform. The executive vice president of Everhart Atlantic was 51 years old and looked like exactly what he was, a senior corporate officer, well-dressed without being showy, silver at the temples. The unhurried physical ease of a man who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any room he entered. He looked at Laurel across the main floor with an expression of warm concern that was among the more complete performances Kellan had seen in a while. Laurel, Blaine said. He opened his arms slightly, an invitation for an embrace that he calibrated precisely warm enough to signal concern, not so insistent that a refusal became a moment. I'm glad you called. Laurel stood where she was. Thank you for coming. I know it's late, of course. Of course. He moved toward her, but slowly, and one of the 2 men stayed near the entrance while the other moved along the east wall. Kellan tracked the second man from the platform. You said you'd found something about the documents, that you thought there was more to it. I've been thinking about the last week, Laurel said. about the sequence of it. And some things don't add up for me. She paused. Blaine, I owe you an apology. I think I let someone use me to go after you, and I didn't see it until now. Blaine's expression shifted into something that was meant to be reassurance. You don't owe me anything. This has been a stressful situation. The mechanic, she said. Voss. The more I look at how he inserted himself at the diner, at how quickly he had information about the contractor records, I think he came in with an agenda. That's what I was concerned about from the beginning, Blaine said, and there it was, the very small relaxation that moved through him at this. Almost nothing. But Kellan saw it from the platform, the slight loosening around the shoulders that said the room was reading the way he'd expected it to read. Blaine moved closer to her, not aggressively, gradually, the way a careful man closes distance. The second man along the east wall had stopped moving. He was positioned between the east corridor and the main floor, and his eyes were moving over the space with the systematic sweep of someone doing a security assessment. He was going to find the equipment platform. Kellan recognized the moment before it arrived, the slight change in the second man's scanning pattern as it reached the west wall, the pause that meant the elevated shadow of the structural support had registered as something worth looking at. Blaine, Laurel said, loudly enough to pull Corbett's attention back to her. I need to ask you something directly. Both men's eyes went back to Laurel. The second man's sweep stopped. The Bellhaven Dock project, she said. The reconciliation report. You signed off on materials charges that I've now looked at in detail, and I need to understand what you knew about the suppliers. The warmth in Blaine Corbett's expression underwent a small and precise shift. Not disappearing, recalibrating. He looked at her for a moment. That was 4 years ago, he said. I know when it was. I'm asking what you knew, Laurel. His voice had changed. Not threatening, not yet, but the performance of warmth had dropped a register into something else. What is this? A conversation, she said. That's all I said it was. You said you had questions about Voss, about the documents. I do. One of those questions is how someone coordinated a response to my arrival in West Haven within 2 hours of me getting here, when I hadn't told anyone I was coming. The warehouse was quiet enough that Kellan could hear the harbor outside, the low, constant sound of water against the pier supports, the metal creaking of the structure in the wind off the water. Blaine stood still. He was doing the calculation. Kellan could see it, the rapid, controlled assessment of what this moment actually was and what options it contained. You're recording this, Blaine said. Not a question. I'm having a conversation, Laurel said. Blaine looked at the man near the entrance. A small gesture, barely a head movement, and the warehouse doors slammed shut. The second man along the east wall moved toward Laurel. Search her, Blaine said. The warmth was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was much quieter and much colder. The second man found the primary recorder inside 40 seconds. He held it up. Blaine looked at it without expression. Then he looked at the room, really looked at it, the way a man looks when he's stopped performing and started thinking, and he said, to the space in general, whoever is in this building, this is the moment to consider very carefully what happens next. Laurel said very steadily, Blaine, you don't want to do this. I want you to sit down, he said, and I want whoever came with you to understand that there are significantly worse outcomes available here than a quiet conversation. The man near the entrance pulled the main breaker. The warehouse went dark. Kellan was already moving. He came off the platform in the complete dark with the precise economy of someone who had mapped the space and didn't need light to navigate it. He moved south along the west wall, using the structural supports as reference points, feeling the floor for debris, keeping his steps controlled. He could hear the second man moving somewhere to his east, could hear Blaine saying something sharp and quiet that he couldn't fully make out. He found the east corridor breaker panel by feel third panel from the left, exactly where the building schematic had shown it, and killed the secondary circuit that powered the east corridor lights, which were the only backup lights in the building, leaving the east wall man without even that reference. Greta's voice in his ear, team moving to secondary positions. We lost the audio feed when the breaker went. Backup is still live. The backup recorder. The one Blaine's man hadn't found, because it wasn't in the obvious places. Kellan moved back toward the main floor through the maintenance passage, came out behind the east corridor man's last known position, and found him by the sound of his breathing and his footsteps. The man was good, not panicking. moving methodically, trying to locate Laurel by sound. Kellan came up behind him and applied pressure at two specific points, the way you do when you need someone incapacitated without sound, and the man folded against the wall and stayed there. On the main floor, there was the sound of a scuffle and then Laurel's voice, sharp, "Don't." Kellan moved toward the sound. The man near the entrance had found Laurel in the dark by following her breathing, and Blaine was somewhere between them and the main doors. Kellan came around the south end of the equipment row and found the geometry of the room by memory main entrance north, Laurel south center, Blaine somewhere between. He said quietly, "Blaine." The silence that followed had weight in it. "The man on the east wall is down," Kellan said. "Your other man is between you and the exit, which puts him between us, which is not a position he's going to enjoy." He paused. "Let her go and we can talk," a beat of silence. Then Blaine's voice, still controlled, still with that infuriating steadiness, "You're the mechanic." "Former mechanic," Kellan said. "Currently unemployed." "Who are you?" "Someone who picked up a coffee at the wrong diner on a Tuesday night." He kept his voice level. "Let her walk to the exit." The sound of movement measured, deliberate, and then Laurel's voice from nearer the exit. "I'm clear." "Good," Kellan said. He hadn't moved from where he was standing. He had Blaine's position approximated from the voice and was holding it. "The investigators outside have a warrant application that's been waiting for probable cause. The conversation you just had with Laurel Everhart is recorded. The primary recorder your man found was the one we expected him to find." A long silence. "The Bellhaven project," Kellan continued. "The shell companies. The manifests that Danny Reeves sent to Laurel. Ray Sutter's account of how his exit was managed." He paused. 3 years of travel records showing financial transfers to jurisdictions where the extradition paperwork is complicated. 2 bookings in the next 3 weeks to the same jurisdictions. He let that land. You built something very patient and very careful, and you nearly made it work. But you moved too fast when it started to unravel, and fast moves leave traces. "This is inadmissible," Blaine said. "Everything you just described." "Maybe," Kellan said. "That's for people with law degrees to sort out. What I know is that the investigators outside have been building this from the regulatory side for 2 years, and they've been waiting for that connects the internal documentation to external financial movement. The backup recorder is their thread." He paused. "You can talk to them outside, or you can stay in here in the dark. But it ends the same way either direction." Another silence. Longer this time. "Where is Trent Mallory?" Kellan asked. No answer. "Because the assault complaint against me, the edited security footage, the call to my home, those are separate charges from the financial crimes. And the investigators outside are specifically interested in who coordinated them." He kept his voice even. "If Mallory is someone you can deliver, that's a conversation worth having with whoever is going to be representing you in the next 48 hours. In the dark warehouse on Pier 19, with the harbor grinding against the pilings outside and the cold coming off the concrete floors, Blaine Corbett made the sound of a man whose calculation had finally run out of options that led anywhere favorable. The main entrance door opened from the outside Greta's team, reading the silence correctly, and the beam of flashlights cut across the warehouse floor. And in the sudden half-light, Kellan could see Blaine standing in the center of the space, with his hands at his sides and his face wearing an expression that contained no performance whatsoever. Just a man at the end of a long plan that had run out of runway. The investigators came through the door. Kellan stepped back from the main floor to let them work, the way you step back when the part that belongs to you is done, and the part that belongs to other people has arrived. He found Laurel outside on the pier, standing at the railing with the harbor spread out in the dark below her, the cities across the water making orange smears on the surface. She had her arms crossed against the cold. The backup recorder was still in place. She hadn't touched it. He stood beside her at the railing. Neither of them said anything for a while. "The backup recorder," she finally said. "Held up," he said. "How do you know?" "Because Greta confirmed audio continuity from the moment the primary was found." He paused. "We have his voice saying he wanted you to sit down. We have the physical intimidation, and we have the investigator's testimony about the circumstances." She nodded slowly. She was looking at the water. "It's not over," she said. "The lawyers, the board, the regulatory process."
No.
He agreed. "It's not over. It's just different now. She turned and looked at him. She looked tired and cold, and something else that wasn't quite relief, and wasn't quite satisfaction, and was probably the particular feeling of having done a hard thing and come through it without knowing yet what that means. Your job, she said. The repair yard. I'll make sure. Don't, he said. Not harshly, just definitively, not like that. That's not how I want it back. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded. Okay, go talk to Greta, he said. They're going to need your statement while everything is fresh. She pushed off the railing and walked back toward the warehouse entrance, and Kellan stayed at the railing and looked at the harbor in the dark. Somewhere out there, the working boats he'd spent 2 years repairing were moored for the night. Somewhere in Decatur, Sadie was asleep in his brother-in-law's spare room, safe and entirely unaware of any of this. Danny Reeves was still out there somewhere. That was the thing that sat at the edge of everything, the thing that the rest of this didn't touch. The framework was crumbling. The evidence was building. But Danny Reeves, with his 2 kids and his 11 years on the West Haven docks, was still wherever he'd gone on Tuesday night when he'd set his phone face down on his kitchen counter and walked out his unlocked door. Kellan stayed at the railing for a while longer, listening to the harbor. Then he went back inside to finish what had started in a diner over bad coffee on a Tuesday night when 4 men had walked through a door looking for the wrong woman. Danny Reeves came out of hiding on a Saturday morning, 11 days after he'd set his phone face down on his kitchen counter and walked out into the West Haven rain. He called Laurel directly from a borrowed phone from a motel room in a small town called Garrett's Crossing, 60 miles north of West Haven, where he'd been staying under a name that wasn't his, paying cash, watching the local news on a television that got 4 channels and keeping his curtains closed. His voice on the phone was rough with 11 days of bad sleep and worse food, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding themselves very still for a very long time while the world outside the window decided what it was going to do. He said, "Is it over?" Laurel said, "Yes, come home." He drove back to West Haven that afternoon in his brother-in-law's car, which was the car he'd borrowed to leave in the first place. And when he pulled up to his duplex on the South Dock side, and his daughter came running down the front steps and hit him somewhere around the midsection, he stood on the sidewalk in the thin November sunlight holding on to her with both arms and didn't say anything at all for a while. Kellan heard about it from Laurel. He was at his kitchen table when she called, helping Sadie with a math worksheet that had something to do with fractions and was producing in Sadie a level of personal offense that Kellan found both understandable and slightly disproportionate. "He's home," Laurel said. Kellan set down the pencil he'd been using to sketch out a fraction diagram for Sadie's benefit. "Good," he said. "Is he all right?" "Scared, tired." "His kids are with him." A pause. He said he knew they'd be watching his phone. He said he figured the only way to stay safe was to disappear completely and trust that someone was working on the other end of it. Another pause, smaller. He said he trusted that I was. Kellan didn't say anything for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the West Haven sky was doing the thing it did in November, low and gray and very certain of itself. The kind of sky that had made its decision and wasn't interested in feedback. He was right to, Kellan said. "We got lucky in some places," Laurel said. "Yes," he agreed. "We did. He wasn't going to pretend otherwise." There were 3 or 4 moments in the previous 2 weeks where things could have gone a different direction and didn't. And the difference between those outcomes and the one they'd gotten was not entirely a product of good planning. Some of it was timing. Some of it was Blaine Corbett's impatience overtaking his usual carefulness. Some of it was luck, plain and unadorned, and Kellan had spent enough time in situations where luck mattered to know that acknowledging it wasn't the same as being grateful for it. It was just being honest about the math. "Kellan," Laurel said. "Yeah, thank you." He was quiet for a moment. At the table, Sadie's had taken over the pencil and was now drawing what appeared to be a very angry fraction on the worksheet's margin, giving it sharp teeth, which Kellan felt was arguably a more accurate representation of the situation than anything else. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "There's still a lot of legal process to get through." "I know, but I want to say it anyway, before it gets complicated." He accepted it. Not graciously, not with deflection, just accepted it the way you accept something real when someone offers it plainly. "Get some sleep," he said. "You've had about 16 hours in the last 2 weeks. 14, she said, but approximately. He heard something in her voice that wasn't exactly humor but lived in the same neighborhood as it, and then she said goodnight and the call ended, and Kellan sat in his kitchen with the gray November light coming through the window and his daughter's furious fraction monster on the worksheet beside him. "Dad," Sadie said, "I need help with the actual math part." "I know," he said. "I'm right here." What followed the arrest at Pier 19 was not fast or clean, because nothing involving corporate financial fraud and multi-layered legal exposure was ever fast or clean, and anyone who told you otherwise had either never been through it or was selling something. Blaine Corbett was arrested that Friday night and released on bond by the following Monday morning, which was how these things worked when the person being arrested had resources and lawyers who were very good at their jobs. The charges were serious fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, a list of specific financial violations that the State Financial Crimes Unit had been building architecture around for 2 years, but serious charges and immediate consequences were not the same thing. And Kellan had enough experience with how institutions move to have expected exactly this. What he hadn't expected or hadn't fully prepared himself for emotionally, even if he'd prepared for it intellectually, was the counter-narrative. Blaine Corbett's legal team was skilled and they were fast, and within 72 hours of the arrest, they had deployed a version of events that reframed everything. The meeting at Pier 19 became evidence of entrapment. The backup recorder became an illegal surveillance operation. Kellan's military background was characterized as the profile of an operative, hired by a rival development company to destabilize Everhart Atlantic's West Haven acquisition. The assault complaint from Trent Mallory was amplified. Trent had his own lawyers now, apparently, and his own grievances to air, and the edited diner footage made another appearance in a different outlet with a longer segment and more analysis. For about 8 days it looked bad. Kellan's name was in local news twice more. A blog he'd never heard of published a piece suggesting his real role in the situation was financial. His neighbor, a retired postal worker named Franklin, who'd known Kellan since he moved in, knocked on the door one evening and said, uncomfortably, "I don't believe any of it. I just wanted you to know that." Kellan thanked him and meant it, and after Franklin left, he stood in his hallway for a moment, doing the breathing that managed the particular cold anger he'd been carrying for 2 weeks. And then he went back to Sadie's room where she was doing her reading, and he sat on the edge of her bed, and she handed him the library book without looking up and said, "You can read it too, if you want. But you have to start from the beginning, not from wherever I am." "Okay," he said, "and no skipping pages. I know how books work, Sadie. You skipped a page in the dolphin one. That was an accident. You said it was. I'm not sure I believe you." He sat on the edge of her bed with the library book about deep-sea creatures and read from the beginning, and the counter-narrative being deployed against him in the West Haven local media did not come into the room with them. The legal picture shifted in the 3rd week. Ray Sutter gave a formal recorded statement to the state financial crimes investigators, and his account of the Belhaven Dock project and the specific way his exit from Everhart Atlantic had been managed corroborated the documentary evidence in ways that the defense team hadn't anticipated, because Sutter's access to the project had given him visibility into details that weren't in any document details he'd simply remembered. The way people remember things they've carried with them for 3 years, because they never quite made peace with them. Then Trent Mallory's own men started talking. Not all of them. Not to law enforcement directly at first. But the 2 who'd been arrested at Pier 19-1 recovered, one still carrying the specific discomfort of having been incapacitated in the dark by a man who'd made it look easy, had their own legal exposure to think about, and their lawyers had apparently done the math on what loyalty to Blaine Corbett was actually worth to them in concrete terms. Information started moving through proper channels in the way that information moves when people are recalculating their best available options. Trent Mallory was arrested in his home city 14 days after Pier 19. The assault complaint against Kellan Voss was withdrawn the following morning. The repair yard called Walt Greer. Kellan let it go to voicemail the first time, then called back the next day. "I want to be fair with you," Walt said, "because I think I wasn't before." "You were in a difficult position," Kellan said. "I was in a position I should have handled better. There's a difference." Walt was quiet for a moment. "The job is here if you want it. I can't undo the 2 weeks. But the job is here." Kellan thought about it for a real moment. Not performing consideration, actually considering. I appreciate it, he said. I need to think about some things first. Can I come in next week and talk it through? Of course, Walt said. Doors open. He didn't go back to the repair yard the following week. What happened instead was that Laurel called him and asked if he had time to meet, and he said yes, and they met at a coffee place on Harbor Street that was not the Harbor Moon. Neither of them had been back to the Harbor Moon yet. By unspoken mutual agreement, and Laurel sat across from him with her coffee and a folder, and the particular focused expression of someone who had been thinking carefully about something for a while. I want to offer you a position, she said. I know, he said. You mentioned it. Executive Security Director. The salary is my... I don't want it, he said. She looked at him. Not surprised she'd expected this. He could tell, but working through how to proceed. Okay, tell me what you want. He'd been thinking about this for the better part of 2 weeks, in the background hours. The early mornings before Sadie woke up, the drives back and forth to Decatur when he'd collected her, the evenings when he'd been sitting in his kitchen with the legal updates filtering in and the neighborhood settling into its quiet. He'd been thinking about the men he'd known, the ones who'd come back from service to lives that didn't quite fit anymore, who'd spent years knowing how to operate in high-stress environments and found no particular translation for that in civilian worlds, who'd gotten good at managing danger for other people without anyone having taught them how to build something for themselves. He'd been thinking about Danny Reeves, who had 11 years on the West Haven docks and had risked everything he had to get information to the right person and had nearly paid for it in ways that couldn't be undone. He'd been thinking about Sadie, who had lost her mother at 7 and who deserved a father who came home not just physically but actually, who was present rather than managing the distance between his old life and this one. He put it to Laurel plainly. A crisis prevention program, he said. Waterfront focused, because that's what I know, and that's where the vulnerabilities are. Hiring former service members, veterans, who need the bridge from military to civilian work that nobody's building for them. Training them for maritime security, cargo integrity, physical protection of workers in industries like this one. Staffed properly, run with actual operational standards, not as a feel-good PR initiative. He paused. Separate from Everhart Atlantic's corporate structure. Independent, with its own board that includes dock workers, not just executives. Laurel was quiet for a moment. You've been planning this, she said. Thinking about it. There's a difference. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. You said that to me before, in Danny Reeves's apartment, about the legal situation. It applies twice. She looked at her coffee, then back at him. Funded how? You fund the startup. The program generates its own revenue through contracts, maritime security, cargo monitoring, port district consultation. It's not a charity. It's a business that also produces something that matters. He paused. Everhart Atlantic can be its first client, not its only one. What do you need to start? 6 months of operational funding. A space in the waterfront district, and Danny Reeves on the advisory board, if he's willing. She looked at him for a long moment across the coffee shop table. Outside on Harbor Street, West Haven moved through its morning, the dock workers heading to shift, the delivery trucks managing the narrow waterfront roads, the harbor gray and workmanlike in the November light. Yes, she said. That's it? You want me to negotiate? I want you to make sure you actually thought about it. I've been thinking about it since the night you told me you wouldn't take the executive position, she said. I knew you'd come to me with something. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it would be something like this. She paused. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to just hear it and not argue with me about it. Okay. What you're describing is worth building because of who you are. Not who you used to be. Not the Navy SEAL in the corner booth. You right now, who drove a 9-year-old to school every morning while all of this was happening, and still managed to dismantle a 9-year corporate fraud operation with a library computer and a legal pad and a conversation in a dead man's apartment. She held his gaze. That's the person who should be running this. Kellan looked at his coffee. He was not particularly comfortable with this type of directness delivered about himself, and Laurel knew that and had said it anyway, which he supposed was its own kind of statement. Okay, he said. That's it? You said not to argue. She laughed. It was a real one, not the carefully managed expression of a corporate executive managing a conversation, but an actual laugh that surprised her slightly, which made it more real. He found himself smiling at his coffee cup before he could stop himself. They sat there in the Harbor Street coffee place for another hour, working through the preliminary structure of what would eventually be named the Voss West Haven Initiative, which was a name Kellan considered too grand, and which Laurel considered appropriately descriptive, and about which they disagreed productively for 3 weeks before settling on something both of them found acceptable. Danny Reeves, when Kellan called him the following week and explained the advisory board idea, was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I don't know anything about being on a board." "Neither do I," Kellan said. "We'll figure it out." "What would I actually do? Tell us when what we're building stops serving the people it's supposed to serve. You've been on the docks for 11 years. You know what those workers need better than anyone I could hire." Another silence. "My kids," Danny said. "They keep asking me why I was gone. I've been trying to figure out how to explain it." "What have you told them?" "That I found out something wrong was happening, and I needed to keep it safe until someone could do something about it." "That's accurate," Kellan said. "My daughter said that sounds like a superhero thing." A pause. "I didn't know what to say to that." "Tell her you're the kind that doesn't have a cape," Kellan said. "The kind that just shows up." Danny Reeves took the advisory board position. The legal proceedings against Blaine Corbett moved through the system, the way legal proceedings moved, not quickly, not cleanly, with reversals and continuances and defense strategies that required patience from everyone who wanted to see a particular outcome. There were 3 months where a specific evidentiary question about the admissibility of the backup recording threatened to unravel a significant portion of the case, and Kellan spent those 3 months being carefully not anxious about it in front of Sadie and being actually anxious about it in the car. Greta Hansen navigated it. The state financial crimes investigators built their case with the patience of people who had been building it long before Pier 19 and weren't about to let a procedural argument dismantle 2 years of work. Ray Sutter's testimony held. The documentary evidence, the shell companies, the billing structures, the 6-year-old correspondence with the registered agent address held. Blaine Corbett entered a guilty plea 14 months after his arrest to charges that included financial fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The plea negotiation was complicated, and the outcome was not as severe as Laurel had hoped or as lenient as his legal team had fought for. And when it was finalized, she called Kellan from her office and said, "It's done." And he said, "How are you?" And she said, "I don't know yet." Relieved, I think. Also just tired in a way I didn't know I was carrying until right now. "That's what the end of something feels like," he said. "How do you know?" "I've ended a few things," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The workers who were displaced. The fraudulent subcontractors, they're still operational under different names. Some of them. Greta's still working on it. It's not fully resolved. "No," he said. "That part continues," he paused. "That's why the program matters. You can prosecute the crime after it happens, or you can build something that makes it harder to hide in the first place." "You sound like you're giving a speech." "I gave the speech twice this week already. To 2 different maritime security conferences. It gets more polished with repetition." "You hate giving speeches." "I hate giving speeches," he confirmed. "I also do it anyway." She laughed again, that same real laugh that still surprised her slightly when it came, and he sat in his truck in the parking lot of the program's new waterfront office and let himself feel something uncomplicated for a moment. Something that didn't have a tactical component or a risk assessment attached to it. It was a strange feeling, not unwelcome. The program had been operating for 7 months by then. 11 veterans hired and placed. 3 maritime security contracts with waterfront operators in West Haven and 2 neighboring harbor cities. A cargo integrity monitoring partnership with the Port District that was already identifying billing irregularities that would have slipped through the previous system without notice. Not a transformation of everything, not the solution to everything. The beginning of something that would outlast the particular crisis that had produced it, which was the only kind of beginning worth building. Danny Reeves attended every advisory board meeting. He came in his work clothes because he still worked. The docks still ran his independent cargo operations, because the prosecutions had untangled the fraudulent subcontracting that had been squeezing out the independents, and he sat at the board table with the quiet, watchful seriousness of a man who understood that the thing being built had cost something real and wasn't going to let that cost go unacknowledged. Kellan respected him for it. The anniversary of the harbor moon came on a Tuesday, the way it had to, because it had happened on a Tuesday, and West Haven was doing the same thing it had been doing that night: cold, salt wind off the harbor, the clouds sitting low like they had opinions when Kellan pulled up to the diner with Sadie in the passenger seat and Laurel's car already in the lot. Sadie had been asking questions in the weeks leading up to this, the way children ask questions when they've understood that some significant happened, and they haven't been given the full story yet. Kellan had been honest with her in the age-appropriate version, which was to say he'd told her that some men had tried to hurt someone and he'd helped, and that it had made things complicated for a while, and that it was better now. She had pushed because she was Sadie, and Sadie pushed. "Were you scared?" she'd asked. Some, he'd said. Of what? He'd thought about that. Of making the wrong call, he said. Of not seeing something I should have seen. Of he stopped. Of not being there. For you. She'd processed that for a moment with the seriousness that 9-year-olds brought to things that mattered to them. But you were always there, she said. Yeah, he said. But there were moments when I wasn't sure I would be. She had looked at him with the specific direct gaze that she'd had since she was very small, and that still, after everything, could catch him off guard. Well, you were, she said. So, and then she'd gone back to her book, which was her way of closing a conversation that had reached its natural conclusion. Now she hopped out of the truck in the Harbor Moon parking lot and looked at the diner with the critical assessment of someone encountering a place she'd heard about but hadn't been to. It's kind of ugly, she said. It's not about the looks, Kellan said. What's it about? The coffee's bad too, he said. Come on. Laurel was in the corner booth, not Kellan's usual corner, the opposite one, the one where she'd been sitting a year ago, when 4 men had walked through the door. She stood when she saw them, and there was a moment of the slight awkwardness that still occasionally arrived when the 3 of them were together, the residue of an unusual history, and then Sadie said, "Hi." Laurel, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone for whom Laurel Everhart's presence in their lives had long since become a given rather than a novelty, and the awkwardness dissolved. Marta was still working the counter. She looked at Kellan with the recognition of someone who had witnesses, something she thought about occasionally. The usual, she said. Please, he said, and whatever they want. They settled into the booth. Sadie, after brief deliberation, ordered hot chocolate and a grilled cheese, which Marta confirmed was possible, and then Sadie looked around the diner with the frank curiosity of a child cataloging a significant location. Which booth were you in? She asked Kellan. He pointed. She looked at it. Then she looked at the booth they were sitting in. And Laurel was here? Yes, Laurel said. And the men sat there? She pointed to the booth nearest the door. The one who was the problem sat here, Laurel said, indicating the seat across from her. Your dad was already in his booth. Sadie processed this geography seriously. Then she looked at Laurel. Why did they pick you? She said. Like, why you specifically? Kellan watched Laurel with the particular attention of someone who wanted to see how she handled this, not because he doubted she'd handle it well, but because he was curious what she'd say. Laurel looked at Sadie for a moment. Then she said, because I was sitting alone and I wasn't making a lot of noise. And they thought that meant they could do whatever they wanted. Sadie frowned. That doesn't make sense. Being quiet doesn't mean anything. No, Laurel said. It doesn't. But some people read it that way. That's their problem. Yes, Laurel said, it is. But it was also mine that night, because their problem became something I had to deal with. She paused. That's the part they don't warn you about. Other people's bad logic still lands on you, even when it's not your fault. Sadie considered this. Is that why Dad got involved? Because they had bad logic? He got involved, Laurel said, because he's your dad. Sadie looked at Kellan. Kellan looked at his coffee, which was exactly as bad as he remembered it. That's not an actual reason, Sadie said. It's the only one that matters, Laurel said. There was a small silence in which Sadie decided, apparently, that this was sufficient and went back to her hot chocolate. Kellan looked at Laurel across the table and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, which had become, over the past year, one of the more comfortable modes of their relationship, the silences that didn't need filling. They had not been fast about each other. That was the thing he'd want to say. If asked, they had not been fast. There was no single moment, no dramatic declaration, nothing that could be tidily identified as the beginning of it. There had been a year of working together and fighting about the program structure and disagreeing about board governance, and Laurel driving Sadie to her dentist appointment the one time. Kellan had an unavoidable emergency at a port's security review, and Sadie coming home that evening and reporting that Laurel had very strong opinions about the music she played in the car. There had been 3 or 4 conversations that started as work conversations and became something else without either of them managing it particularly gracefully. There had been the night 4 months ago when Kellan had said, in the parking lot of a board member's retirement dinner, that he'd been thinking, and Laurel had said, "What about?" And he'd said, "You know what about?" And she'd said, "Yes, I know." And they'd stood in the parking lot for a while not saying anything else, and that had been, more or less, how it started. It wasn't perfect. It had rough patches and misread moments, and the specific complications of 2 people who were both more comfortable managing difficulty than receiving ease. It was like most things worth having, a work in progress. But it was real, and Kellan, who had spent a long time keeping real things at arm's length for reasons that had made sense at the time, had decided that real was worth the difficulty. Sadie, across the table, was building a small architecture out of sugar packets while waiting for her grilled cheese, stacking them with focused engineering intention. She had her mother's hands, Kellan thought, the specific shape of them, the way she worked. He thought this without the particular weight it used to carry, not without feeling it, just without being unable to carry it. It had taken him a long time to get to that distinction. He didn't think he'd have gotten there without the last year, without the specific disturbance of being forced back into something that required to be fully present rather than managing the distance between himself and his own life. There were things the diner night had cost him, the 2 weeks of professional damage, the fear that had moved through him when the blocked call had named his daughter's school. That fear had not fully left him, which he accepted. You didn't stop fearing for the people you loved. You just stopped letting the fear determine the circumference of your life. There were things it had given him that he hadn't expected. The program. Danny Reeves at the advisory board table. The veterans who'd come through the first year of the initiative and built something out of skills they'd been told had no civilian application. The particular satisfaction of having done something that mattered, and having done it in a way he could look at directly. And Laurel. Though that was more complicated to attribute to a single cause, because people didn't happen to each other because of events. Events just created the conditions under which people could choose. He'd chosen. She'd chosen. The rest was the ongoing work of it. Marta brought the grilled cheese. Sadie dismantled her sugar packet architecture to make room, thanked Marta with the complete sincerity that she brought to all transactions she considered fair, and applied herself to the food. "Dad," she said, around a bite of grilled cheese.
Yeah.
"When you sat in your booth, that first night, before anything happened," she looked at him. "Could you tell something was going to happen?" He thought about that honestly. "I could tell something was off," he said. "The men who came in. The way one of them looked at Laurel before he sat down." He paused. "I didn't know what was going to happen. I just knew it wasn't right. And then you did something about it." "Yes." She nodded, working this over. Mrs. Campton says, "The difference between watching something wrong happen and doing something about it is usually just deciding that it's your business." Kellan looked at his daughter. "Mrs. Campton's right. She usually is." Sadie took another bite. "I think I want to be a marine biologist. But also maybe a detective. Can you do both?" "People do harder combinations than that," Laurel said. "Like what?" "Like running a company and investigating fraud at the same time while eating terrible coffee in a diner at midnight." Sadie looked at her. "That's not a real job combination." It was for 1 week. Sadie thought about this and accepted it with the particular generosity she extended to adult explanations that were strange but internally consistent. Then she turned back to her grilled cheese and the matter was closed. Outside the Harbor Moon, West Haven was doing what West Haven did, the harbor grinding against its pilings, the dock lights making orange lines on the water, the cold coming in off the channel with purpose and no particular concern for anyone's plans. The city had its problems still, the way cities always did. The waterfront development continued. The Worker Protection Board that Laurel had established inside Everhard Atlantic had already filed 3 internal complaints against contractor relationships that didn't look right, and 2 of them had produced results. The process was slow and imperfect and required constant attention, which was the nature of processes that actually mattered. Kellan sat in the Harbor Moon diner with his daughter eating a grilled cheese and the woman he had chosen, and the coffee was bad, and the ceiling fan was still wobbling through its rotations with the tired commitment of something that had been doing this for a long time and was going to keep doing it regardless. And through the window, the harbor was dark and the city lights were on, and somewhere out there, Danny Reeves was home with his kids. He had spent years believing that the way to protect the people he loved was to watch every entrance, track every variable, maintain the operational awareness that had kept him and the men around him alive in environments that required it. That was not nothing. There was a version of that vigilance that was simply love expressed as attention, and he didn't think he'd ever fully stop being the person who sat with his back to the wall. But his back was not to the wall right now. He was sitting in the middle of a booth in a diner that served bad coffee, with his daughter on his left and Laurel across from him, and the entrance was behind him, and he had not once looked at it since they'd sat down. He had not looked at it because he was here, not monitoring from a distance, not maintaining the careful separation between himself and the moment that had been for so long his version of safety. He was here, in the room, at the table, present in the way that was harder than vigilance and more demanding than any operational posture he'd ever maintained. Real strength wasn't about being ready for the next threat. He understood that now in a way he hadn't a year ago, not as an idea, but as something he'd actually arrived at through the specific friction of this particular year, this particular set of choices. Real strength was building a life worth staying in and then actually staying in it. Letting the people you loved see you completely, not just the managed version of yourself that was always ready to move. It was being the person at the table rather than the person watching the door. It was this, right now. Bad coffee and a wobbling fan, and a 9-year-old with grilled cheese, and a woman who laughed with genuine surprise when something caught her off guard. Marta came by and refilled his cup without asking. He drank it anyway.